Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us today to learn about how Change Healthcare has used AWS Managed Services to help them with their undifferentiated infrastructure operations so that they can focus on creating business value that hopefully you've heard before from Change as they've spoken at several reInvents in the past. My name is Mike Eshu. I'm an AWS Managed Services Specialist Solutions Architect, and I'm joined today by Arian Malik, who's the SVP of Research and Development with Change Healthcare, who's going to tell Change's story of deciding to and choosing to adopt AWS Managed Services. Thanks for joining us, Arian. Over to you.
Thank you, Michael. I'm really pleased to be here to talk about Change Healthcare's journey toward the cloud and the role that AMS Managed Services or that AWS Managed Services is performing for us. So just for background, Change Healthcare is a leader in healthcare technology. We really focus on the middleware of the U.S. healthcare system in particular. We're an international company, but the bulk of our business is in the United States. And a lot of that middleware is the transaction flows that sit in between all of us as patients receiving care at providers, physicians, hospitals, labs, pharmacies, and the like, and the payment for care, and all of the administrative and financial flows in between that. That's really the lifeblood of the U.S. healthcare system. The money flows of the U.S. healthcare system that allow the clinicians of the world to concentrate on providing patient care. And we've been in this world for literally decades because we're sitting in the middle of the participants in the U.S. healthcare system. By definition, we don't have installed on-premise systems that are sitting in their offices. We've had to build out a SaaS-based multi-tenant set of platforms to serve those customers, many, many years ago. And back in the day, there was no HIPAA certified, HITRUST certified, yada, yada, yada certified provider of infrastructure technology. That heavy lifting was a differentiator for us. We took on the work of building out scaled data centers, making sure that we had the physical security, the data security. We're doing the patching, patch compliance, and the like. And a number of years ago, we decided to jump headfirst into the cloud, starting with a partnership with AWS. And we've built out, like a number of companies, in our trajectory, we've built out a set of leading edge cloud native AWS services that are serving needs of our customers in production. And also we had this very significant footprint of data center assets that are sitting out there in serving our customers' needs. And while when we started the work of this cloud transformation, I'm not sure that AWS could spell HIPAA, much less figure out how to adhere to it. We had to work with them to figure out the HIPAA compliance activities associated with business associate agreements. At this point, they've got a laundry list of certifications like HIPAA, PCI DSS, HITRUST, FedRAMP, et cetera, including certifications that frankly we've never heard of. And a lot of the work that we necessarily engaged in a decade ago, 2 decades ago, has turned out to be a non-differentiated asset right now. At the same time, as I said, we have all of these assets that are sitting in these data centers that are serving customer needs, and we can't just make them go away. So we had to put together a transitional strategy that leveraged the footprint that we have in AWS to serve customer needs, but allowed us to put together a migration factory from the on-prem systems into AWS. And so that's the effort we set in front of ourselves. If we go on to the next slide. The goal that we wanted is to be able to build that transitional asset that allowed us to put more and more in cloud native services. We believe there's a significant cost benefit to going cloud native. There's a significant scalability benefit and elasticity benefit for going cloud native. And we wanted to make sure that we had a transition model that served us well, that was able to take those undifferentiated, those previously differentiated activities, move them into a cloud posture, take some of that undifferentiated heavy lifting off of us so that we could afford to build more assets into AWS. So if we can go on to the next slide. Like many companies, we can't stop operations, and we're a publicly traded, publicly listed company, and maintaining consistent free cash flows is a really important thing for our shareholders. So, the cash flows that were tied up in those data centers are real cash flows. They're real cash outlays that we're doing. We can't stop them. So we're in a little bit of a quandary. We knew how to build AWS-based services. We knew how to run our on-prem services. We knew we didn't want to be in the on-prem data hosting business forever. But we really were trying to figure out how to break this impasse of how do I take these free cash flows that are sitting in the data centers and without impeding customer satisfaction and operations, deploy cash flows into modernization. And I'm sure that's a business problem that many people, many companies who are like us are facing. So we fortunately had a little bit of a forcing function that that got us off our seats to be able to address some of the conundrum that we faced. We integrated Change Healthcare and the technology assets of McKesson, which is a Fortune 6, Fortune 5 company. And as part of that integration, we founded a new company called Change Healthcare that we then took and publicly listed as a publicly traded company. And part of the transition was a full separation off of McKesson. And part of that McKesson separation was a full separation off of the McKesson data center assets. So we have a significant set of our technology holdings that are sitting in McKesson data center assets. We had a ticking clock where the world would end. McKesson had no interest in being in the data center hosting business, and every interest in getting us off. And we had a set of contractual commitments that forced us off. So that was the real forcing function. And we put together a business case for that transition. We modeled it both ways. What would it look like if we took the assets directly to the data center, or if we took the assets to AWS in conjunction with AMS, Amazon Managed Services. And we made the decision that even though the business case was net neutral from a cash flow outlay perspective, the strategy of getting these assets into AMS in the cloud in a pure lift and shift approach gave us so many more degrees of freedom that it just made a ton of business sense, all other things being neutral, to go that direction. So if we go on to the next slide. We then were forced with the decision about how we did that AWS migration. And we'd been working with AMS as a transitional zone, probably like a lot of companies. We had a number of teams that knew how to build cloud native services. We also had a number of teams that had primarily lifted and shifted a bunch of assets that still had patch responsibilities and OS upgrade responsibilities and a whole set of undifferentiated lifting opportunities that they were then experiencing in AWS. So we've been working with AMS as a landing zone. And based on the work that we've been doing, we made the decision to work with AMS, Amazon Managed Services, as our partner in this transition. And the thought process is AMS will take over the undifferentiated data center services we previously had in our data center. They take over a portion of that stack that involves things like logging into servers and doing patch maintenance and patch management, building security perimeters, watching our logs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, while we take over the application functionality. So we built the business case, we built the business model, we built the transition plan, and we jumped in to this process. So if we go on to the next slide. Um, the goal here was, as we got AMS to take over and catch these systems, we are able to take the people that we free up in that process who are now trained on the cloud, trained on AWS, and get them to work on higher order business problems. The notion that we would have our cloud trained specialists figure out how to do automation for patch management in AWS just seems sort of mind boggling, when we could have those same people work on higher order problems like how do we optimize eligibility claiming and payment flows for the US healthcare system? How do we take out administrative waste and inefficiency in the US healthcare system and return a good chunk of that value back to all of us as taxpayers? Those are higher order problems. Patch management, log management, et cetera, are lower order problems. We're quite happy to have AMS perform. So as I said, we've been talking about this for a long time. This is a quote from our VP of Infrastructure and Cloud Operations, who's been leading the bulk of the effort here. And it was a big scale for our teams. Our teams could focus on learning the basic cloud skills that they need to build the next generation of applications, and a lot of the heavy lifting of the migration and post-migration day one activities would be taken over by the AMS team. So if we go on to the next slide, I just want to talk a little bit about the flywheel. So the flywheel that we're trying to build here is one where every step that we do leads inexorably into benefit for the next step. So the way we think about this flywheel is that I've got a set of cash flows that are tied up into a legacy data center. Great. If I build a migration factory with, in partnership with AWS and AWS Managed Services, that takes those assets out of the data center and puts them into AMS on a cost-neutral basis, that's great. As a consequence of that, I've trained my teams in cloud. And I've also taken a good chunk of the workload off those teams so they can go concentrate on higher order business activities. That's really cool. So I've freed up talent. I've also freed up some of the undifferentiated data center assets. The next thing that moving to AMS allows us to do is that it allows me to tune the cost deployment day one. So if I'm building a migration factory where I'm migrating from one data center asset to the other, I've got to pre-purchase all of my hardware, all of my software. I start the depreciation on that on day one. It's all fixed cost. That depreciation and amortization sits on my balance sheet, fixed cost. The cash flows and cash outlays sit on my balance sheet, fixed cost. When I move to AMS, I discover that a little bit of database tuning allows me to reduce some of the expenses that I have by a significant amount. So in a similar effort that we did a lift and shift effort for our Commonwealth clinical interoperability service from an on-prem data center to AWS. And we'd had a ton of automation there, so we didn't move it to AMS because a lot of that automation job was taken care of, but we did a lift and shift migration. And we're able to discover with the help of AWS ProServe that moving from native IaaS MongoDB to the managed document DB Mongo compatibility layer that AWS provides allowed us to free up a ton of cash. And those are the kinds of decisions that we get to make day one, post lift and shift. Every one of those decisions frees up cash that then funds the next migration. So that's the flywheel. The flywheel is I take a data center asset, I move it from our on-prem data center into AMS. As a consequence of doing that, I train people and take my cloud trained people and get them to deploy on higher order problems. I take a bunch of the undifferentiated heavy lifting off of the teams that we have onto the AMS team. So now I've freed up people to go work on those higher order problems. And then I get to, on day one, start to ramp down and meter down the costs, which frees up frees up cash. So I freed up people and I freed up cash to go fund the next tranche of migration. And at the end of time, I might have a set of data center assets, legacy assets that are sitting on AMS in perpetuity. But my goal is, over time, I bleed those AMS assets down to zero, do the modernization that helps me drive the next level of innovation on cloud native services. How's this been going? We've already moved 2 key business applications, a bunch of environments into the malls, the managed AWS landing zone. We got it done faster than we expected with AWS's help. We've trained all of our staff on cloud. We've avoided significant fixed cost investments, so that really helps us kick off the first wheel of our flywheel. And we're feeling really good about the decision that we made and where we are. So if we go to the next slide. I just wanted to do a shout out for HIPAA, for information security, for compliance. So we would not have made this effort were it not for the investment that AWS has made generically into things like HIPAA certification and PCI DSS certification and FedRAMP certification. We're seeing that to be, by the way, a significant upside as we are in the U.S. healthcare system, inevitably working with federal and state payers that have FedRAMP requirements. Our ability to leverage the modernization that we're doing across multiple realms of compliance takes a lot of load off of the work that we're doing. And this was a must do. 0 degrees of flexibility, 0 degrees of freedom. And I got to say also, Amazon is kicking our butt. They're forcing us through a whole bunch of things that we did in the data center that I think anybody who was in a data center did at one time, which is, I got to go do that security compliance thing, but I'm going to go, I got to get this up and running for customers now, and then I'm going to go fix it in 6 months from now, and 6 months comes, and there's something else, and something else, and something else, and now we're going through the migration. We've got to go clean up all of those things. We don't have the 4 walls of our data center to protect us. So Amazon's been a great partner in pushing us through those activities and making sure that we're improving our information security compliance even above the HIPAA baseline that we'd already established for ourselves. If we go on to the next slide. And so far we've been talking about the lifting and shifting of data center assets into AMS, but we really see this as part of an innovation factory, as part of our transition from lift and shift to modernization to innovation. And we've talked a little bit about the flywheel that we're building. The second wave of modernization is just as important to us as the first wave. So first wave is IaaS-based lift and shift assets, and then tune them to free up cash. Second phase is take the cash that we free up and use it to build modernization. And then the third wave of that is use that modernization to drive additional innovation. So each one of these waves is a key part of the flywheel. In the first turn of the flywheel, we're reducing cost. In the second turn of the flywheel, we're adding value for the U.S. healthcare system and for our customers globally, which allows us to reinvest in this flywheel. So we really do see that the lift and shift migration to AMS is just the first part of this. The second part is modernization, moving to cloud native services, like we've already done in the Intelligent Medical Network and the Healthcare Data Cloud, the Intelligent Medical Network, because we build on technologies like ECS and Fargate, allows us to very rapidly scale up and scale down with pretty massive elasticity. And as a good example for why that could be really useful for a clearinghouse, we basically do our work based on the volume of care that's delivered in the U.S. healthcare system. And mostly that's predictable. It has massive spikes that are seasonal. And then there are sort of non-predictable shocks like a massive pandemic that both depresses initially and then accelerates spend in the U.S. healthcare system. So as we start to see things like vaccination waves that lead to additional eligibility and claiming additional cash flows going across the U.S. healthcare system. Our ability to scale those systems up is a really critical asset, something that helps us serve our customers better. Likewise, our healthcare data cloud, built on top of S3 and Elastic MapReduce, allows us to build both HIPAA compliant data cloud that protects our customers' data. We've also built in differentiated assets like our ability to model HIPAA data use agreements and data rights, and we wouldn't do that if we weren't able to build on top of the primitives that AWS provides us. And so that second wave of modernization helps us drive innovation, our ability to launch new product to market and provide new value for customers. So if we can go to the next slide. So Michael, I just want to pass it back on to you. I think I've talked about a set of challenges that are important for Change Healthcare, but I don't think that the challenges that we face are particularly Change Healthcare specific. I believe that we're facing a bunch of challenges that many companies just like us face. So over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Arian, and appreciate both the story and setting up exactly the paradox that I wanted to start with, right? And I think between Arian and I, we use the word undifferentiated. You could argue we may have even been competing for how many times you can say it, but I think it makes so much sense when you think about the paradox that you see on the screen. 88% of enterprises with a cloud-first strategy, but 86% of spend still on premises. So it's exactly that paradox that you have because you're doing that undifferentiated work of hosting the data center and doing infrastructure operations that's not allowing you to get to the more important work of business modernization that Arian spoke about. And why, right, we continue to see, and you can see our source material there, 60%, 63% of executives suggesting it's because of cloud skills. And so it's for that exact reason that we saw a challenge in the marketplace. And so AWS looked at this and we said, well, why is this? Cloud talent is hard to find. As you build it, it can disappear quite quickly. And I might argue one of the reasons it'll disappear quite quickly is what you see in the upper right, which is the majority of the work isn't differentiating, right? So I got excited, I learned the cloud skills, I learned how to use our serverless capabilities, our EC2 capabilities, our serverless database technologies, and now you've got me back patching EC2 instances or virtual machines with database technologies running on those because of licensing agreements, and that's just not what we want our cloud talent working on. And then so we'll turn to labor arbitrage, and I think that's thinking about it in a legacy manner. There's an opportunity now, if you employ the right people, that get excited about automating away that lack of differentiation that's frankly common between nearly every customer, whether using Linux or Windows. It's the same type of commands that need to be run either via Bash or via PowerShell, and I can automate away that work instead of just trying to find it at a better price offshore, where I still actually have to wait for the work to be performed versus a computer doing it at pace. And then another thing that stood in the way is these heavyweight contracts and SLAs. We agree to a predetermined amount of people that are going to conduct these activities versus giving a lever that Arian spoke about, being able to turn up or turn down operational services, just as you turn up and turn down these infrastructure services. So AWS Managed Services, this is what we built to respond to this customer need. And starting from the bottom left, we start with that secure and compliant landing zone. Within about a day's time, we can lay down that landing zone that's HIPAA eligible, high trust certified, PCI DSS attestatable. You can go into AWS Artifact today and see the very attestations that we use. FedRAMP, ISO, SOC, and so on. Ultimately control mappings back to NIST 853. And as I mentioned, we fuel it with automation. We hire staff who are passionate about not performing the same task twice, and they build automation so that it either runs without need to call for it or gets automatically fulfilled on customer demand, delivered when you need it without human intervention. And then if something does go wrong, a patch doesn't take, we're able to go in with our operational professionals, figure out why, and fix it. And not just fix the individual incident, but actually conduct a problem management process so that other customers don't have to learn the same lesson and we don't have to spend our operations engineering time fixing the same problem twice. And we do that with a team of AWS cloud experts, all AWS staff that are performing the manual aspects of our service and doing that automation development. And then ongoing cost optimization. We provide a cloud service delivery manager whose job it is to ensure you're implementing our cost recommendations. So, of course, you're using Trusted Advisor to identify your cost savings opportunities, but making sure that they get implemented and going in and reminding operation teams to do things like turn environments to perhaps development environments, or make sure auto scaling groups are indeed scaling down on the weekends when they're not needed in the use case that Arian described, and you can imagine many others. Trusted Advisor finds that opportunity, and we make sure it gets implemented, or we're at least putting it in front of you as an opportunity to save money each day. No vendor lock-in. You can move workloads in and out. You don't have to do term contracts, right? So you're deciding with every deployment, just as I mentioned, to consume operational services or not, giving you that cost flexibility. So you're only paying for it when you use it. And ultimately, right, a consumption-based price model and SLAs that are designed to meet business critical needs, but also designed to support development and test workloads, which may not need the same level of service as your production systems. So we built all this on standard AWS tools and then customer-owned assets. So if AMS comes out of the account, we leave that landing zone and that configuration in place, and you can move forward with your own operations team should you choose. We have lots of ways of helping you, right? So we described AWS Managed Services, but just as Arian said, we work closely with our AWS Professional Services team. They're helping with the migration at Change Healthcare and developing other technologies that Change Healthcare is able to consume. We're all backed by AWS support. So just as when AWS Managed Services needs to say escalate an incident up to the operating system vendor, we go through AWS support to get help with the AWS services that we operate, just as you're able to do that directly in non-AMS managed accounts. We have AWS IQ, where you can get AWS professionals available on demand from the AWS console. Of course, we have our training and certification team, where we can train you both on AMS if you're an AMS consumer and all of our other AWS services. And then most importantly, our AWS partner network, where you're able to bring in partners that have specific experience. If you're not a consumer of AWS Professional Services, you prefer to use a partner you've been working with for a long time. This is a set of AWS Managed Services partners. Lemongrass, where we're looking at SAP on AWS opportunities with infrastructure operated by AMS, vended by Lemongrass. We work with our set of American partners that you see there, Cirrus, Intervision, Ulstra, and then an EMEA Tech Racer, and APJ Cloud Comrade, who we're excited about several new use cases we'll be talking about in the press shortly, and then TechX. So what are the next steps? Reach out to your AWS account team. If you are operating scaled infrastructure operations and you'd like to get your staff focused on the innovation business moving use cases, right? If you want to get out of the undifferentiated business and focus all your resources on the differentiated business, we'd love to help you with that undifferentiated work. And you can also see some of the cost justification. Arian mentioned some of the processes they went through to build the business case. We're happy to help you do that. In fact, Forrester did a study to look at the total economic impact of consuming AWS managed services. And one of the things that really stands out to me, right, is the staff avoidance of having to do this work. So when I free up folks that are, we're looking at patching and so on, what are they able to create, and what's that feedback to the business that can be achieved? And that's detailed in the study. The link should be in the content tab of your reInvent experience. And lastly, you can click the link for AWS Managed Services to see a more detailed description of what AWS Managed Services is. You'll find some of our documentation online so you can see the processes we follow and how you'd go about adopting AWS Managed Services. But we'd love to help you build your operating model and help build your business case so you can get your engineering staff focused on those business outcomes. So thanks so much for joining us today and hearing from Change Healthcare. Thanks so much to Arian for taking the time to tell its story. It's always powerful to me when customers willing to take time out of their busy schedules to sort of talk about some of the success they've been able to have with different AWS services, and of course here specifically AWS Managed Services. Thanks so much, and with all presentations, please do take the time to give us some feedback on how compelling or otherwise you found this story and what you'd like to hear about next. We look forward to hearing from you. Thanks for joining.